Very good. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. So, hello, everyone. I have to proceed my talk with a little warning because if you're expecting me to give answers, you're not going to get them. This is the subject of intelligence, in which you end up questioning dogma and wondering what the real answer is. And then I'm going to flit away, leaving you in bafflement. And I hope interest enough to start looking for your own answers. And in that case, my mission will have been accomplished. That's my goal always, is just get people asking questions. So let me share this screen here. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, wait, which one is it? I have multiple screens showing up here and none of them look right, but give me just a second. Let's see what this one looks like.
No problem, take your time.
Okay, oh, I see the problem. Yeah, I have not run Zoom on this machine before, so it doesn't believe that I have the authority to show these things. Oh, wait. No, cancel that. Come on, let's see if it will work now. I should have tested this a few minutes ahead of time, but okay.
Oh, there it goes.
There we go. Okay, you got a screen. Good.
Yes.
Good. All right. So anyway, where am I? Let me start magic words that you see up there. These are terms that we throw around willy-nilly within the atheist community. And while they have some specific meanings, they become well-worn with overuse to become a little more than godless shibboleths. So I'm referring to reason, rationality, logic, and understanding. These words have been abused to the point where they're little more than labels anymore. So take reason, for instance. That's the power of the mind to think, understand, and form judgments by a logical process. That's a fine thing to do. I think reasoning is a good idea. I bet you all agree with me. If only we were truly capable of it. We often muddle this with rationality or the quality of being based on reason or logic. Again, this is a great idea. So we have to struggle, though, to be rational, to be reasonable, to do all these sorts of things. So rationality in particular is often distorted. We also use it in the word rationalize, which is
I think we lost him.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is it just me or is it him?
Not just you.
Yeah, he's frozen.
Yeah.
Unless he's just being very still.
Yeah.
Check the spider.
Yeah, it was the spider.
Yes.
Someone
her
like
babies.
Spider-Man, you know.
Exact broke.
I think he'll probably rejoin us as soon as he can.
Probably. Well, hope everyone's doing okay today. Any questions anyone wants to bring up while we wait for Dr. Myers to rejoin us? Hopefully rejoin us.
I see Andrea made it.
Just out of curiosity, I hadn't heard this thing. I don't follow news, but so far 2 people agreed that someone was saying that we should start wearing masks again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I hadn't heard that. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Even if you're vaccinated, the strain is, it's not going, if you get it, it's not going to be as bad, but if you don't want it, you best wear a mask. And plus you can pass it on to others if you're not.
It may not be as bad, but it'll be a decided inconvenience.
Yes.
So we're kind of going back to square one, huh?
Yes.
Well, maybe square 2. I don't know. Well, at least we've all got a goodly supply of masks. Nice.
I was reading about that office in Bradenton that had the
Yeah.
outbreak, and the family of one of the women who died, who was 58 years old, who was unvaccinated.
Mm.
They're saying that she didn't die from
Oh,
COVID. She
COVID?
died from stress. And it's made no difference that there's the rest of the family still not getting vaccinated.
Here he is.
Yes.
Mm.
You're back.
And welcome, Jacob, and welcome, there you are. Let me.
Yes, hi, this is Jacob.
Okay, and I'm making you co-host again, and I'm going to spotlight. Whoops, there you are. Spotlight you. Welcome back. We missed you. However, we're not getting any sound. I'm not getting any sound.
Maybe he's muted.
No,
is
I
that?
checked.
You're still not getting sound.
Yeah, now,
Okay.
No, we're
now,
getting
now we
sound.
are.
Yeah.
Now it's good. Okay. Yes,
But
it was just a big kaboom. Everything went down.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. We can try again.
Yes.
Did you,
All
did
right.
you,
Let's see.
did you pray over your presentation before you gave it? Have you seen them
that
that do
was,
that?
That was what I forgot. I forgot to do that. Oh, no wonder. Okay, well, let's hope this works now. It says I'm screen sharing. So like I was saying, I was just talking about these magic words. And the thing is that I was talking about reason and rationality and how they sound so virtuous and wonderful. But the problem is that you can name a cause that's certain to increase human misery and lead to collapse and failure. And I guarantee you that we'll be able to find people arguing for it. And they'll be using reason to do it. And they're not wrong either. A good sophist can find a rationale for any conclusion using reason. Now, logic is a rather different animal. It's also badly abused, but its definition gives away the game. Logic uses strict principles to assess the validity of its conclusions. There are rules of logic, and logical statements are internally consistent and non-contradictory. There are just two flaws with living logically. The first is who decides the rules. I mean, Catholicism is just as logical as atheism, given its premises. And there's the rub. You have to first accept its premises. But also, too, human minds do not operate logically. We can accept contradictions without a stutter, unlike the computers in Star Trek. We can be told that our behavior does not align with our stated ideals, and our heads don't explode, fortunately. Now, logic is something we might aspire to, but rarely achieve, and then only with strenuous discipline. And even when we achieve that ideal of dispassionate, consistent, rules-based reasoning, it does not mean our conclusions necessarily correspond with human needs or even reality. Mr. Spock is actually a pretty poor role model for atheists or anyone. Okay, what about the fourth word I put up there? Understanding. That's the hardest one of them all, and it's unfortunate. But I don't often see atheists promoting a genuine understanding or comprehension of what may be happening in a complex situation. That word also has an interesting definition, a sympathetic awareness or tolerance. If there's anything the secular community should aspire to, it's that, a greater understanding of the diversity of ideas present in humanity. Okay, but look, I'm getting all fuzzy and humanist and philosophical. Let me focus on something more concrete. Okay, let's focus intelligence. Further to the biology of intelligence. Yeah, that's specific, right? Now I'll be able to provide. I have a PhD from the Institute of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon. I entered graduate school over 40 years ago with the specific goal of figuring out how brains work, and more narrowly, how something so complicated as a nervous system can assemble itself in embryonic development. And lots of people have been working on these problems, and we still don't have complete answers for them. We only have tiny fragments of an answer. So if this were a 30,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and believe it or not, such a thing exists, we'd be at the stage where we've just opened the box and we're sitting there going, ooh, and wondering where we can possibly put this monster. So when I see the word intelligence and so many people talking confidently about how to measure it and how some individuals are less or more intelligent than others, or treating it as some kind of clearly defined quantity, I am mystified. How can you do that? Nobody can even define how to quantify it. Well, okay, there is that semi-tautological about the joke that what is intelligence? It's what IQ tests measure, and that's about it. Now, I don't think it's a totally intractable problem, but it's a very hard one. I think a productive approach is to look at it from the perspective of comparative biology. Unfortunately, one flaw that afflicts that approach is that much of the literature has this foregone conclusion that, of course, humans must be the most intelligent species. Therefore, we have to find a mechanism of ranking intelligence that puts us at the top. One crude approach is to notice that, wow, humans have really big brains. So that's what you're seeing here. This is part of the zippers. So initial
You're
stuff, you
blanking. You're
slap
blanking out.
brains from
Can
different
you
animals,
check your
and sure
internet?
enough, I'm blanking out.
You're fine now.
I'm fine. Yeah, it's something intermittent is going on. Okay. Anyway, so I was showing you these brains and saying, okay, we've got this ranking of brain size, but we humans do not have the biggest. Somehow this is considered slightly disturbing by some people. Instead of just saying that according to our initial hypothesis, whales must have a high degree of intelligence, possibly higher than ours. There must be something else going on, they say. And I have a couple of problems with the premise that this ranking is a problem. One is the idea that intelligence can be quantifiable as a linear metric. Why can't whales be smarter than us, but in a different way than a tool using ape? I think we all agree whales don't go around making tools and using computers, but maybe they're using their brains in a different way that doesn't fit into our model. Maybe part of the problem is that we try to codify intelligence as a single number. Another difficulty with this observation is that it was noted in the 19th century. This is old. And measuring the size of brains of individual people, the size didn't correlate at all with the public perception of their intelligence. Turns out that smart men didn't have consistently larger brains than less clever people. It was also observed that women on average have smaller brains than men on average. In the Victorian era, though, nobody seemed to have a problem with that at all. That just fit the prejudice that much more clever than women. Bit embarrassed that their models don't automatically justify treating humans as the very smartest beings on Earth. If your observations don't support the conclusion, well, obviously, we have to adjust our observations to fit what we want them to say. One obvious interpretation, one obvious explanation that might get us out of this problem is that whales are really big. So maybe it's the size of the brain relative to the body that matters. So let's adjust our measurements. First try, let's divide brain weight by body weight. One goal is accomplished here. You'll notice that since we take whales and elephants down a notch, turning their large body size against them. Unfortunately, it also puts humans in the middle of the pack, which isn't a desirable result if you have that predetermined conclusion. It makes mice the top. So look at there, they have gigantic brains relative to their body size. So Douglas Adams might think that's wonderful, and he might disagree with my interpretation, but I do think it's reasonable to have some kind of threshold for brain size to achieve some of the more abstract functions of cognition. Maybe there is some minimal amount of brain a normal mammal needs to have. Of course, we see even in this chart that mammals of similar body size to mice have even smaller brains. So we should ask, what are mice doing with all that extra capacity? I think the answer there is obvious. But still, this is a problem with our assumption that any metric should put humans at the top. One popular solution to that problem is called the encephalization quotient. Okay, so what the EQ is, the encephalization quotient, is it's a mathematical method. Yeah, it's a mathematical method to compensate for allometry. That is, the scaling of brain size relative to body size is not linear. There are rules of developmental growth in which different organs grow at different rates. So proportions don't scale linearly. For example, you probably know that human babies are born with much larger brains relative to their bodies, but brains grow more slowly than the rest of the body. So adults tend not to have these gigantic bobbleheads they had as infants. That's because the rest of their body grows to catch up. These rules apply across the class. So brain sizes increase at different rates than body sizes for all animals. This is universal. So this graph shows the same thing as the previous figure of absolute brain size against body size. Once again, whales and elephants are shown to have brains that are absolutely larger than human brains. Okay. But now we've added this solid black line that you see on the screen. So this is the brain to body rate ratio of a typical mammal following their shared allometric rules of development. This is the size they should have. The EQ is a measure of how closely the species follows the expected rules. So EQ is a measure of how far the ratio of a species deviates from this straight line. Humans, for instance, are far off the line. We're way up there, far away from that single line. And what that means is that we have a high EQ. So an EQ is going to be a measure of this distance from the dot to the line. And you can see, for instance, horses, dogs, mice, some mice at least, have an EQ of 1.0, which puts them right on the expected mean for a mammal. So they're perfectly normal. The idea is that humans, for instance, have undergone selection for brain size above what we'd expect for a typical mammal. Now at last, we can stick a number on humans that makes them special. Again, you also notice that even though sperm whales and dolphins and all that have these, well, not dolphins, but these have gigantic absolute size brains, they're still well below the line for their body size, which means their EQ is less than 1. So we'd say they're probably not as smart as we think. At least that's the argument. Okay, we can see some obvious concerns with this method. For example, pigs. This one bothers me. Pigs are smart animals. They're well below the line with an EQ that's less than 1. By this measure, horses, cats, squirrels, and some mice are smarter than pigs. Yeah, that doesn't fit with the observational behavioral data that we've got on these animals. You also notice that some dolphins would still rank way up there with us. So yeah, dolphins pretty close to humans as far as the deviation from that line. So their EQ is pretty good. Okay, so when we look at the calculated numbers for the EQ, let's go to a table of all these numbers. So humans, this one right here, they jump out at us with an EQ of about 7.5, somewhere in that range. So that's a pretty large EQ. Dolphins, there's one right there, are about 5. So if we use encephalization quotient as a measure of intelligence, then dolphins, humans are about 50% smarter than dolphins. We don't have an independent way to determine whether that's accurate. There's no IQ test for dolphins, but you get the idea. At least it puts us in a good relative ranking. Also, as a bonus, look down here. Mice are no longer so clever. So we've dethroned mice as the brilliant examples in the mammal lineage. However, often what we seem to be doing these kinds of analyses is to contrive a number that elevates humans to a peak. And one of the criteria for a good hypothesis, so why is the encephalization quotient a good hypothesis? It's because it fits our expectation that humans ought to be at the top of the heap. And that's not a good way of doing science. Again, this is not to say that the assumption that humans are the smartest of them all is necessarily false. People are smart. They really are. We can do things that mice and horses and whales can't do. So, maybe we actually are the smartest species on the planet. Of course, to demonstrate that, we have to have a strong definition of intelligence that is measurable and comparable, and we don't. Things like this encephalization quotient are just stopgap theories that are favored because they elevate humans. We have culturally biased methods that basically assess how well a human can perform in competition with other individuals in narrow specific domains of activity. IQ tests, though, don't work with dolphins, elephants, cats, or mice, or any of these animals. Now, this table tries to show another method, that is counting the number of cortical neurons. That's what this is over here, this third column. This again puts humans at the top, but very, very close to whales and elephants. Now, I have to tell you, this is not a particularly easy thing to measure. It's not a particularly good metric in that sense. Nobody ever counted 11 billion cortical neurons. No, you just can't do that. So that's not possible. What you have to do instead is you measure the density of a small sample of the brain, and then you multiply that by the volume of the brain region. And it's prone to all kinds of variation by sampling error and by fixation differences. The brains you extract from a whale are treated differently than the brains you extract from a human being. So it's really hard to do these kinds of fine-grained comparisons. So I don't think we can actually say that these numbers are statistically different from one another. Now, this is a fraught topic, and I don't think there is yet a clear illustration of a consistent, objective difference in intelligence between these animals, if such a thing is even possible. But we keep trying. This is our hallmark. This is what we think distinguishes us from all other animals. So when you find numbers that say, hey, they're pretty close to us, that's bothersome. How are we going to keep the crown if we have that problem? So we have a lot of different ways that scientists have tried to correlate something objectively biological with this vaguely defined thing called intelligence. Sometimes they show some correlation with intelligence and they get published. Sometimes they don't. And then the protocol gets finagled until the proper correlation, that is the one that puts humans on top, shows up. Now, I don't mean to disparage this work. I think it's important. Progress is by trial and error. And we are still struggling to find a way to measure this thing that seems so intuitively obvious to everyone. And that doesn't mean that we won't someday get an unambiguous answer. We just don't have one yet. Personally, I think we're going to need 1,000 different answers, not just one. But that's further reason to persevere. One thing I would urge, though, is in this kind of research is to get away from mammals and look more at different clades. Everything I've talked about so far is entirely mammalian. And what we need to do next is look to the skies. Yeah, let's talk about birds. You've all heard the insult bird brain, right? The implication being that birds are rather stupid. They're not. They actually have very small brains. That part's true. Their brains are surprisingly small for what they can do. But many birds, particularly crows, ravens, jackdaws, and jays, exhibit demonstrably high intelligence of the sort that humans can recognize. Jays, for instance, have been shown to have a theory of mind. That means they can internally model the behavior of other jays and modify their own behavior on the expectation of competition or the absence of competition. Crows have amazing memories for human faces. So I'm an alumnus of the University of Washington, where some great studies of crow behavior have been and are being done right now. We learned early on that once a crow takes a dislike to you, don't bother trying to hide beneath a hat or even wearing a mask. They can still recognize you. I learned early on that you better be nice to the crows on campus because they don't forgive. They also pass a self-control test that many mammals can't handle. An example of that kind of test is you give them a tube with a food reward in the middle of it. They'll puzzle it out and realize that the way to get the reward is to go through one end or the other of the tube. Okay, makes sense, really obvious and simple. After a while, though, after they've learned this trick, always go to the end and poke your beak through and there's something tasty in there. After a while, you change one thing, and that is you make the tube transparent so they can see the tasty treat right there in the middle without having to go to the end. And some animals will immediately grab for the middle of the tube. Hey, they can see it there. Let's see if I can approach it. Let's go peck on that or grab it with our hands, whatever. Some animals just can't get it. At least not until they tried a few times. Crows, though, will see that same thing. They'll see the transparent tube and they'll say, aha, that's a tube. I'm not going to be able to peck through the sides of the tube. I'll go around to the end and go right to the treat. So they've got that going for them. They're pretty smart that way. And it may seem like a very small thing. Here we are, we humans, we think we're so smart. And you're saying, yeah, okay, that's obvious. We would pass that test right away. But crows do better than some primates. Capuchin monkeys, for instance, failed to figure it out right away. And their brains are 12 times larger than a crow's brain. 12 times larger, and they haven't got it down cold right from the beginning. Crows think a little better than they do. So the birds are doing more with less, and they're doing it differently. One of the brain regions thought to be important in cognitive processing is something called the Wulst. Okay, the Wulst is let's see, did I manage to include a picture of this? Yes, I did. Okay, good for me. So this is the Wulst. This is a picture of a bird's brain. And they are small and they're compact and they're differently organized than our brains. Speaking as somebody who's done a fair amount of human neuroanatomy, that just looks weird. I don't know what that is. They have a structure called the Wulst. It's also called the hyperpallium. And this is analogous to the mammalian cortex. That is the part of the animal's forebrain. And the density of neurons there is about twice what we find in a typical mammalian cortex. So this is a section through the Wulst. And what we find is that they're much more densely packed with neurons than mammalian brains. Now, being twice as dense, okay, that's a pretty big difference. There may be nonlinear advantages to that more close-knit kind of brain structure. Again, we can't just simply look at that and say, oh, it's twice as dense, so they must be twice as smart. No, it doesn't work that way. But it may have some kind of nonlinear influence on whether they're smart. Okay, I'm going to leave vertebrates in a moment, but first I have to talk about one of my favorite organisms. This is the zebrafish. I worked on zebrafish for so many years. Anyway, many fish exhibit a really fascinating phenomenon. So you give an individual an intelligence test. For a fish, that's something like solving a maze or discriminating visual signals in order to get a reward. And yeah, it's kind of demeaning, but you'd come away thinking that fish are pretty dumb. It takes a long time to teach them this stuff. They just don't seem that bright. They can't solve the maze. They can't figure out whether a green light means food and red light means shock until you train them 100 times. Then maybe they'll get it. But here's the thing, you put a group of fish together in the testing apparatus. So not just one fish, you put a bunch of fish in there. And suddenly their intelligence shoots up. Sometimes the difference might be a consequence of stress. Okay, schooling fish don't like to be isolated. So maybe they're just more comfortable with friends around. Sometimes it's due to a phenomenon called the pool of competence. That is, among multiple fish in a school, there are a few that vary in intelligence, and they become the clever leaders who show the other fish what to do. In some cases, though, it's a phenomenon called swarm intelligence. This is not often the way we think about how brains work, but we'll see more of this in a moment. Okay, so what is swarm intelligence? That is, multiple individuals work cooperatively to solve a problem. And they can do this to accomplish more than any one fish all on its own. So they form a kind of communications network, signaling to each other parts of the problem, and together they can solve the problem more efficiently. This makes sense, right? This is what we'd expect from humans. So humans are an excellent example of the power of swarm intelligence. Yeah, we all have swarm intelligence. For years as a teacher, I've given students problems and exams they're expected to work on independently. This past year, while trying to solve my own personal thorny problem of how to teach a class during a pandemic, I experimented with a lot of alternatives to that solo exam paradigm. I discovered that when you let students work together, their performance suddenly improves by a huge amount. And none of you would be surprised by that, right? If instead of making students take the exam solo, you get a group of them together and they can work and collaborate to solve the problem, yeah, they'll get better scores. Sometimes I could tell this was just a pool of competence effect. That is, there's one studious, hardworking student in a group who would do all the work and bring the others to their level of ability so they'd all get the score of the best student in the group. But I could take active action against that. I could consciously break up groups to prevent individuals from dominating the learning. And even if you put a group of slackers together, okay, that's a joke. All of my students are brilliant, but there's relative differences there. So if I put a bunch of slackers together, they learn better and faster. And that's what we see in fish as well. So this year, I've been thinking a lot about teaching and how to do it better. And maybe students could learn better, not just get higher scores in their exams, but learn better, know the material better if they could use their cell phones and Google during an exam. I got to think about that some more. Maybe I'll be trying that in this next year. Okay, let's go on to another example. Let's get out of that vertebrate clade and let's think about invertebrates. Okay, fish show that we have to question some of our assumptions about the structure of intelligence. But how about if we look in animals like the octopus? And you all knew it was coming. I had to mention cephalopods. Cephalopods, in particular the octopus, seem to be relatively brilliant. Reminder, intelligence is so poorly defined that saying one species is smart relative to another, that may be problematic. But yes, octopus seem to have an intelligence that we could recognize as something like our own. So cephalopods are capable of learning. They exhibit remarkable powers of recognition and discrimination. They communicate with pheromones and complex visual signals to their fellow octopuses. And most relatable to humans, they're curious They actively explore their environment. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that these are very, very smart animals. Also remarkable, they do all that with a wall. Yeah, I don't know about you. I grew up with that constant comparison that stegosaurs, for instance, had brains the size of a walnut, with the implication being that they weren't very bright. But maybe we should question that assumption. An octopus can commit intellectual feats with this tiny brain that's wrapped around its esophagus. So maybe we shouldn't be so dismissive of Stegosaurus's intelligence. Anyway, of course, the octopus has another advantage. Its nervous system is distributed. So the octopus doesn't just rely on its central nerve ganglion, it also has a chain of ganglia running down each arm. The greater part of its nervous system is actually strung outside of that central walnut. So they've got a bigger brain than you might think. Still not gigantic, but they have a pretty good sized brain. They know how to use it. In mammals, there's so much effort applied to figure out where the locus of cognitive thought is. And we all assume, okay, it's the brain, and in particular, it's got to be the prefrontal cortex or whatever, wherever. But we really don't appreciate how much processing is done by other, less conscious parts of the brain. When you walk, it's your hindbrain and cerebellum and spinal cord that are doing most of the work. Not this part of your brain, this part way back here and down into your spinal cord. So if you try to consciously control each muscle and movement during a walk, you will fall over. Go ahead, try it. Someplace with lots of pillows, okay? But yeah, you can't do this consciously. When an athlete throws a baseball, for instance, they're relying on the muscle memory that they developed in their lower brain centers after long practice. You could do the same thing to a baseball pitcher. Okay, tell them, think about what you're doing. Concentrate on exactly what you're doing when you're throwing that ball, and they won't be able to do a good pitch, right? Also, when that pitch comes the batter's way, the batter's sitting there. He's not sitting there using his conscious intelligence, his forebrain, to work out the physics and math of the flight of the ball. Most of his response is driven by reflex. That there's circuitry deeper in the brain that is calculating it for him without the batter having to stop and think, okay, how do I do this? When should I swing the ball? What's the right instant to do that? Should I aim high or low? Where? Nope, you don't have to do that. It's all taken care of almost reflexively. My point here is that we have to break out of the habit of thinking there's one way to be intelligent. There's one way to have a functioning brain, that every nervous system is supposed to evolve towards a common goal. And that's not necessarily true. Intelligence is so much messier than we think if we just look at it from a human perspective. Okay, one last thing before I turn this over to questions. So some of you may know that my latest scientific obsession is spiders. Yeah, there she is. She hasn't hatched out yet. Give her time. So I have to say at least a few words about spider intelligence. Now, I know many people are arachnophobic, so I'll warn you that my next slide is a photo of a spider. So if this thing gives you the heebie-jeebies, go ahead, close your eyes now. I'll tell you when you can open them and just listen to what I say. And also just thank me, because I could do a whole hour-long talk on spider brains, just easy. So I'm sparing you that much. Okay, there we go. So there's our spider. Isn't it beautiful? These are gorgeous animals. Now, spiders are evolutionarily successful ambush predators with some active hunters, and all are carnivorous except for one species that I've heard of. Most have a strategy you see here of building these intricate webs to trap their prey. And one of the common characteristics of the clade is the production of silk. Not visible here in just a simple photograph is that different strands of silk have different properties. Some are strong and structural. Others may be sticky. Others may be more like strings for climbing on. There's a whole sophisticated engineering department going on here to assemble a web that looks kind of haphazard, but it's actually fairly complex and has very specific purposes for each kind of silk in this web. Furthermore, the web is a social construct. Literally, strands of silk carry different pheromones. So spiders use an extension of their sensory apparatus. They can sit in a safe corner and be aware of everything that impinges on their environment. Spiders can detect the rate of the wind just by looking at how their web moves in the wind. Other spiders can use it for communication. So they can creep onto a stranger's web and they will pluck the silk in a characteristic fashion, basically playing a song for the resident. So they're saying, you know, I'm safe, don't kill me, don't eat me. Or sometimes they're saying, want to go on a date? There are spiders that live in these communal webs where a whole colony lives together and cooperates in sharing prey or even in guarding each other's eggs. So this web is analogous to an apartment complex, to a house. It's a very important structure for spiders. A lot of spiders cannot survive outside of manufacturing a web to carry out these jobs for them. So spider intelligence is extended by a constructed external tool. You cannot assess the intelligence of a spider by stripping it from its silk. So it's like a school of fish, you know, pulling out one fish and testing its intelligence. You're not getting the intelligence of the fish. You're getting something kind of artificial and arbitrary and not at all appropriate. Similarly, spiders do a lot of calculating of their environment with the web. So you can't pull them away from it, and that's no less because it won't allow you. Yeah, as soon as you pull a spider out of its web, it starts generating new webs. It will be laying down lines all over the place. I've held spiders like this one in my hand, and as they walk around, they will lay down a continuous line of information. So they will actually wrap up your hand, you know, not maliciously. It's just because, hey, they need to know where they've been and where they're going, and they do it by putting down a drag line. So the web is clearly part of a spider's sensory apparatus. It's also part, though, of its cognitive machinery. A spider thinks with its web as well as its nervous ganglia. So apply that concept to yourself. Is your phone part of your brain? How about the whole of the internet? You know, if you could take the MCATs, for instance, or most IQ tests with a calculator, do you think your score would go up or down? It would probably go up. How about if you had a phone? So in the middle of the test, you could call your good buddy who's an engineer or a scientist, ask him to help you out with this. And yeah, that would help you as well. How about if you could just use your phone to get on the internet in the middle of the exam and type in questions and get the answer? Is that cheating? It's what we do in our day-to-day life. And so what I'd say is that maybe it's time that we thought about human intelligence as something more than a property of just a clump of neurons. Okay, so let me hide the spider. Okay, it's safe. If you had your eyes closed, go ahead, open them up now. Does anybody have any questions about what I've been talking about? Does anybody disagree with anything I said? That's fair game too. Oh, I see some people have raised a hand.
Sorry, I couldn't get myself unmuted. Michael, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, talked a lot about the mammals and vertebrates, and you touched on a little bit about the invertebrates and the insects and so on. Have there ever been any studies sort of like all-encompassing, sort of a whole, you know, comparing the vertebrates and the invertebrates, and sort of if there's any sort of continuum or anything that could be discerned from that?
Yeah, there have been review papers on this subject that try to address the subject of general intelligence by doing a kind of comparative analysis. Let me think. I had one right open here just a moment ago, but Roa and Dicka are two people who just published a couple of years ago a big review of all this. And the problem comes when you try to do these comparisons, because what are you going to compare? I mean, their brains are completely different. Their nervous systems are completely different, across phyla at least. You could compare dolphins and people, and what do you find? Yeah, their behavior is so different. Their whole, what they have to deal with is so completely different. It makes it hard to make a comparison. So that's been a big problem. How do you do that? And I haven't seen comprehensive studies that, in one series of experiments try to apply the same test to a whole bunch of different animals, because you can't do it. You have to customize your experiment for each of them. And that makes the comparisons even more difficult.
Have there ever been anything looked at as far as energy expenditure of the brain? Because I know, like humans, we use
Yes.
80% of our energy is used just for our brains alone.
Yeah. So the brain is a great big energy sink, and you're talking trade-offs and expenses when you build a brain bigger and bigger. Now, that gets complicated though, because I mentioned birds. Here you have a bird that's got a brain that's 12 times smaller than a monkey. They don't have quite the energy expenditure going into that, do they? But somehow they manage to be just as intelligent, or possibly more intelligent. Again, comparisons are difficult. So that means that maybe this whole brain comparison is a little bit of a red herring. I would think, though, that in cases like humans, where it's gone to such an extreme, we're ridiculous as far as the relative sizes of our brains. It's worthwhile considering the energy investment. And there have been a lot of studies, anthropological and paleontological studies of relative brain sizes in different hominins. And it gets messy and complicated real fast, because we don't have access to the behavior of those animals, so those organisms, those beings. It's always hard to figure out what to
It's like
call.
Neanderthals had much bigger brains than we did, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were more intelligent.
Exactly. Actually, I had something about that. Let's see. Look here. I knew that would come up. That there is data on relative brain sizes of these different hominins and apes and so forth. And it looks like this. So this is the body weight to brain size ratio. And Neanderthals have relatively bigger brains than we do. Does that mean they are more intelligent? Oh, no, I don't think we can make that judgment. I would also point out that here's Homo sapiens. We've been around 1300, 1400 cc's for the entire history of Homo sapiens. So we're talking 200,000 years. Yet we only developed agriculture roughly 5,000 years ago. Why? What was holding us up? Were we stupid before 5,000 years? I don't think so.
About 10,000 years ago, actually, but
okay, yeah. Well, 5 to 10,000 years ago, we developed agriculture. We developed all these other things. We can see a progression of better and better tools over that period. What changed, if anything? And I don't know. Why am I supposedly smarter than Cro-Magnon man? It's because I have a cell phone, right? That's extended my intelligence, maybe. Or books, or libraries, or better, more reliable source of nutrition, or hygiene. All these things that improve our health have contributed to this.
Thank you, Michael. Did that kind of get to where you wanted to go?
Yeah. I mean, I got much more, but I want to dominate this whole discussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jim Young?
Just a couple of thoughts that came to mind. during your talk. One was, it seems to me that trying to compare different organisms is like comparing apples to oranges. And things like brain size or the ratio to body weight, to brain weight, and some of these metrics that are being used to supposedly measure intelligence or something. It just seems to me that a lot of these things strike me personally as irrelevant. And the reason I say this is because I'm thinking about the fact that organisms are constrained by their physical capabilities, by their environment, by the tools that are available to them, by the ability to store knowledge and pass, or inability to store knowledge and pass it on to future generations. There's so many factors that figure into what can seemingly make one species of animals appear to be smarter than another. And obviously human beings, we have what seems like the best of all worlds. We have ways of storing information, passing it on to our descendants, creating new tools. And once those tools are created, they continue to serve our species generation after generation. We're building, constantly building the complexity of our, I don't know what you want to call it, intelligent system, so that we appear to be smarter. We are certainly solving problems faster, and we're solving more complex problems than we used to be able to do. And it may not necessarily have anything to do with our, well, it has something to do with our biology, because we have arms, we have fingers, we have voices, we have physical attributes which allow us to make good use of the tools that we have at our disposal. So I just wanted to throw this in there, that I think it's really tough to try to evaluate intelligence when you have all these other factors essentially muddying the water so that you can't see clearly.
I agree 100%. And that was one of the points of my talk, is that intelligence is far more complex than what we try to, reduce it to. It's nonlinear. It's dependent on a confluence of factors. You mentioned one thing. I would say, for instance, that the fact that we evolved hands was a huge advantage for the progression of intelligence. And then developing culture, where we transmit ideas from generation to generation. This also is a huge factor. We can build on the past, which gives us a huge advantage there. And it's just been accelerating. You invent literature and books, you invent computers. Suddenly the shoulders of giants keep going up higher and higher, and you can keep going even further on them.
Yes, and if you had a way of stripping all of that away, you throw some human beings on an island where they have nothing at their disposal. They're back to square one. They have to start all over from scratch. They're still intelligent. They're still problem solvers, but they don't have the advantages of their ancestors.
Yes. Yeah, there's literature that explores this idea, and I'll just mention one well-known book called Earth Abides by George R.R. Stewart. I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's a really good book that covers exactly this topic, that there's a worldwide pandemic. It wipes almost everyone out. So basically what it does is it removes that foundation of literature and knowledge and experience. And what happens next? it's told from the point of view of a protagonist who says, well, I'm going to go to the library and I'm going to pull out these great books and I'll build this body of information anew from that. And what actually happens is that people don't want to do that. They want to live their lives and get by day to day. And so you get a rapid regression to a much more, I hesitate to use the word primitive, because, any successful human population, that the important word being successful, is not necessarily primitive. But yeah, that's a common thread.
Thank you, Jim. Jim Peterson has questions, comments.
Well, my proceeding friends have already touched on several of the points I was about to make. However, I believe that the principal thing that makes humans intelligent is the fact we have a confluence of the threshold amount of organic support for a being, which and that includes not only the brain size, but also the fact that we have hands. We can manipulate things. We can create material culture, which it makes us very different from many other species, which perhaps have greater numbers of cells in our brains, in their brains, that make them intelligent. Things like whales and dolphins, for instance, but yet they have no ability to manipulate their environment. And of course, the big thing for us is not so much the hardware or GUIware, but rather the software. The fact that we do have a culture, and a culture which allows us to be much larger and have access to different kinds of stimuli and reach different kinds of conclusions based on our participation in that culture. I cannot read all the literature in the Library of Congress. Nevertheless, I can get to most of it, and so I can build upon those things I can get to make a difference. And this is what I think makes me human and makes other people human as well.
Yes, and I would just point out that I think one confusion that's often made is you're talking about the features that make you human, and I would agree with you 100%. Those are things that make us a human being. But when we ask the more general question of what makes for intelligence, we still don't have a good way to tell how intelligent a dolphin is. Okay, we can make that assumption that the only kind of intelligence that counts is the kind of intelligence that builds a material civilization with technology and all that sort of stuff. And then we'd say, well, yeah, then obviously dolphins are less important. But it's entirely possible that there's alternative ways that brains can work in very sophisticated ways. Maybe dolphins are out there writing great poetry. I don't know. Yeah, but it doesn't make that kind of material difference. It doesn't necessarily make the kind of thing to build upon. Although you could say, well, maybe subsequent generations of dolphins are getting better and better at poetry, and we just can't tell.
Or music.
Or music, or maybe they're great philosophers and they're all sitting there coming up with wonderful ideas, or maybe they're fantastic mathematicians. We don't have a way to measure that.
Thank you,
Right.
Jim. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, well, yes.
Okay.
Interesting dialogue.
Bill Northworthy, I saw you wave. I'm assuming you want to ask a question.
Yes, I'm talking to you from my phone and I can't figure out how to get the hand to go up. I need more intelligence here. My question revolves around something you said right at the beginning, which seems to be a very, very important part of our brain function, and that is the emotional versus the rational aspects of it. And we seem to rely to a much greater extent on our emotional responses than we do on our rational. And I'm wondering if there is any way of evaluating that in other species as well, and what your thoughts are about the balance that we have between emotional and rational thinking.
Yeah, that's another thing that's really hard to measure, because you cannot strip somebody's emotional sense out and see how it affects their behavior. It's just impossible to strip it out. Yeah, years ago, I was working on a project in grasshoppers, which you normally don't think of as particularly intelligent, but one of the things we were looking at is the neuroendocrine system and the parts of the nervous system that innervate the gut. And we pretty quickly realized this was a bigger job than looking at the central ganglia of the grasshopper, that there's a huge portion of the nervous system that we tend to overlook and not consider all that important. And it's the case in humans too, that there's all these neurons that are lining our gut that are doing all kinds of important things that have been known to have effects on the psychology of individuals, right? So if you've got a tummy ache, it's going to affect how your brain works, the cognitive, intellectual part of the brain. And that we have no idea to what degree the proper operation of that portion of your nervous system is to the function of the expressed part of your brain. And so that's another common phenomenon. And yeah, that the emotional part is just as important. As I mentioned early on, we aspire to be logical, but we rarely are. And it's the emotions that lead us in different directions. And so much of people's intellectual position is defined not necessarily by an objective analysis of the evidence, but by the fact that this is what we want to be true. Yeah, we atheists run into that all the time. We have to recognize, though, that we also do that. We also have our own biases that get expressed in that way.
Bill, did that answer your question, or do you have something else?
Yes, very, very good. Thank you.
Rick Pearson asked in the chat, are you talking about the enteric nervous system?
Enteric and the endocrine system, they all work together. Yeah.
Okay. Michael is back.
Yeah, I'm gonna just have two quick questions. For
okay.
Evolutionary speaking, I mean, biologically, the human species, why we're so successful is due to the fact that we have this very generalized biology. Like our hands, our feet aren't really adapted for any one thing. Like horses have hooves, so I mean, they're not very good at, manipulating tools and so forth. And I kind of wonder, like, is what we're thinking of as intelligence just a measure of the plasticity of our brain? Like maybe our brain is just more biologically plastic than the other animals and species on this planet.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually was, when I was putting this together, I thought about what's a positive thing I can say about intelligence. And I came up with my own definition of intelligence, and I think it might include some of that. Let me go. Where'd I go?
You stopped sharing your screen.
Did I just close?
But we can see you.
Yeah, we can see you.
Oh, okay. Let me bring it back.
Okay.
About this. Let me share this again. I hope that, let's see, where to go, there we are. Okay. So yeah, this is what I was trying to think of as a positive way to say, what is intelligence? How do we use it in the world? And one definition I came up as this is that intelligence is a measure of our ability to model the world in a useful way. So, our perceptions are all filtered through our senses, and we build these big intellectual model of the world. And so what intelligence is how comprehensive, how useful is that model in navigating the universe as we do. And it's kind of a powerful way to look at it, because then, you know, for instance, a spider is intelligent. They can manage their way through their world with no problem. They can accomplish all kinds of useful things for the survival of the individual and the species. But that kind of puts everything on an equal footing. So another possibility I thought for definition of intelligence is this one, which might get to what you're talking about, that intelligence is a measure of our ability to change our internal models. So it's about flexibility, generalizability. I think most spiders are kind of fixed in how they view the world, and they will respond to changes in their environment by usually dying. Okay. And humans, I think, have this general intelligence that allows them to, in the best of all possible worlds, change our minds and think in a different way about how the world works. And I think that's a big contribution to our success.
Yeah, I think definitely, because I mean, the way I look at it is we're not an observational species. In fact, we're extremely bad at observing things. We're bad at observing distances, measurements, time, pretty much across the whole spectrum. But what we are good at is we're good at interpreting the world. So we don't observe the world around us, we really interpret the world around us. That's just my
yeah, you know, in my
anthropological
first
thing.
Yeah, I thought about that in my first definition too, and I thought, okay, my first choice was, okay, it's a measure of our ability to model the world in an accurate way. And I don't think that's right, because what matters is the utility of your interpretation. So the fact that we can generate these multiple interpretations in different ways and assess, not necessarily, is this the best way of looking at the world, as is this the best way for me to make my way through the world? What's useful for us? So when you look at religion from that perspective, for instance, I don't think religion is at all accurate. Okay, I don't think there's a God. I don't think it influences anything in the world. But it may be an extremely useful way in a social group to cohere and to make progress as a community. And in that sense, you know, a religious person is using their intelligence to build a model of the world that helps them get through everything.
Yeah. Actually, you just kind of brought me to what my second question was. You were talking about the swarm intelligence versus the other forms of intelligence. I mean, do you think religion is maybe an interruption of that swarm intelligence? Because, I mean, you're kind of abdicating, you know, your viewpoint to an outside source. You know, you're saying all the knowledge of the world and everything comes from the book or the God or the whatever.
Would you think it's an interrupt?
You're breaking up for me. I don't know if you're breaking up for everyone else.
Yeah, everything's breaking up a little bit right now. Okay, but I think I get your point. Is okay that maybe by building this particular model, you're disrupting the efficient operation of the swarm intelligence. That suddenly you've got something where you're imposing an interpretation that isn't responsive to new signals, new information from around you. And that may be, you know, that my problem with that is that I think religious people are actually pretty good at recognizing the signals of their co-religionists, that they're actually working together. You know, it's not blindly following dogma to do what they need to do. They're actually wrestling with dogma constantly. And in that sense, I would consider it a continuation of swarm intelligence. But as I say in my first definition up there, it's not accurate, but it may be very useful.
It may be useful, but I think it also kind of makes its way into these very closed models of the universe, and if it, it could just kind of end up spiraling where you're just making more and more closed models of the universe instead of opening up here
Right. So,
outside data.
if your model is not accurate and responsive, it may be useful in the short run, but eventually you're going to run into something that your model cannot accommodate anymore, that doesn't fit into the paradigm or the dogma or whatever, and then you're going to have a crisis. So yeah, maybe short term, but not necessarily long term utility in religion.
All right.
Jim has another question. I'm sorry, Michael, did that resolve? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great.
Jim has another question, but I have a question.
Okay.
Concerning Michael's statement about how we're not good at observing, isn't there a lot of evidence that we used to be really good at observing the world, because we did a lot of things like Stonehenge, and even those giant figures in the desert, they had to be able to do that by eyesight. They did not have the same tools that we had, is my understanding. I could be wrong.
Right. Yeah, but I think the thing is, we're not saying that ancient peoples were no good at observation. It's more that observation is a skill. It's a hard skill. You got to really work at it.
Yes.
And in modern science, you need to develop new tools, of new ways of measuring things, new ways of looking deeper into structures, and yeah. So it just requires so much hard. It would be so nice if I could get a student into my lab and I didn't need to teach them anything. They just looked at the spiders and said, okay, here's the answer, and here's how I'm going to. But it doesn't work that way. And so I think observation is kind of an important skill to learn. And clearly, Paleolithic peoples had to observe carefully to make the kinds of discoveries they did. So
right.
Yeah, figuring out agriculture 10,000 years ago, no, that wasn't just, oh, pure chance, we'll stumble on. No, this was people who were looking at the world around them.
Yeah, if they didn't observe, they were going to get wiped out.
Right.
Jim Peterson?
Yes. Well, I'm wondering what your opinion, Dr. Myers, is of the future of intelligence. We are more than all Strelopithecines with microscopes. We are very dynamic, and we've changed over time. And of course, our culture helps us change more quickly over time. Given the past 200 years of change that we have seen, and the fact that even the measured intelligence over the past 100 years has seemingly increased, that is, our ability, the general ability of the population to handle problems has significantly increased, as measured by, say, the Wechsler test and so forth. And I'm wondering if advancing into the age of AI and other kinds of technological improvements of our native organic abilities will what would be your conjecture about how this will change us?
Well, first I would say that it's kind of an open question whether we really have changed. In the last 100,000 to 200,000 years, have we actually acquired biologically new abilities, or have we just managed to build and build and build on prior knowledge using the tools that nature gave us right from the origin of our species? So in that sense, yeah, have we really improved over time? Do we then expect that there will be further improvement? And I don't know that I would. The trend for the last few thousand years is that, for instance, brains have gotten smaller. Maybe they've gotten more efficient. I don't know, but we haven't seen that kind of progressive increase in size. That humans in general have become more gracile over these millennia. So what does that mean? If we're going to ask about the future of intelligence, I would say that we're going to continue the trend. We're going to develop new tools, more tools to extend our intelligence. But the native stuff that's going on in our brain, the stuff that's built in here, I don't know that will necessarily change. Now, it's possible I am totally wrong about that there has been some invisible progressive change in the quality of our brains over the last 10,000, 100,000 years, whatever. We just don't know. And maybe there will be future changes in that direction. That some people are arguing now that the increasing frequency of autism is just a symptom of some changing gene frequencies that are relevant to technological advancement. Evolutionary biologists do not predict the future, though. Sorry. The one thing we know is it won't come out the way you expect it to.
Thanks.
Thank you. Jim, that answered your question?
Yes.
Okay, we're almost out of time. So I'm going to go to Jim Young, but you got to keep it short, Jim.
Maybe a couple of months ago, we had a guest speaker who was talking about the idea that the human brain we are still blessed with the Cro-Magnon brain. And when I think about this, I think about the fact that naturally, we are not good thinkers. We tend to have all of these prejudices and other things going on that interfere with our ability to think objectively and solve problems. So we, as much as we would like to think that we're just wonderful thinkers, truth is we're pretty bad thinkers. And so we've had to actually study the science of critical thinking and come up with these concepts and learn them and then apply them. And this has helped us to think better, but the brain itself is still plagued with the same old problems, and every generation that comes along has still got those same old problems. So I'm kind of convinced that we still have the Cro-Magnon brain.
You're muted, Dr. Myers.
Okay, there. I agree completely with that we are pretty bad thinkers. That, for instance, what science is a set of tools that we use to enforce good habits in thinking. That science in some ways is kind of a straitjacket that says, yeah, this is what you're allowed to infer from this body of evidence. If you want to go beyond that, you got to get some more evidence. So it's clearly the case that we need all kinds of artificial help and conceptual help to think well. And it's one of the things we do with schools, supposedly, is bring people in and teach them how to think in a disciplined and good way about everything. So yeah, I would agree. We're all bad thinkers, me included.
Thank you, Jim. Michael, is there anyone else who has a question before I hand it over to Michael? Because he's going to get the last question. Going once. Okay, Michael, it's yours.
Okay, I just want to make one quick clarification about the observations thing. That's not to say that humans don't make observations, and sometimes great observations, but it's more to say that, say if you take a person and just ask them, how far is this away from you? More than likely than not, they're going to be very inaccurate with their measurement. And there's a reason why eyewitness testimony is considered very inaccurate testimony. So that, when I'm talking about observation, I'm more talking about that. And as far as the future of intelligence, I don't know if this was the place we had that discussion with, or if there's another one, but we have this idea, I've heard this before at least, that human beings are kind of at the limit of their intelligence because, like you're saying with the energy suck, that, the more intelligence we get, we're not going to have the energy. Our body isn't going to be able to produce the energy, and that the future directions of intelligence are going to be more with the melding of biology with technology. I mean, do you think that's an accurate statement? Or is anything to that?
Sort of. I mean, okay, yeah, the point being that, okay, I agree with you about the observations. Yeah, that you don't see engineers going out and eyeballing something before building it. You gotta do all these tricks and pull out rulers and laser measures and things like that to do it. So yeah, that's entirely true. The future of intelligence, well, the thing is, if I think we're kind of physiologically, we're at the limits of how big our brains can get. That we're not going to see us develop significantly bigger brains unless there's some mutation that really revolutionizes the metabolism of humans, and I just doubt that that will happen. But on the other hand, look how far we've come since the Stone Age with these same brains. I just don't see it as a limitation yet. We are constantly extending the abilities of our brains with new tools. You know, computer science, this is a new tool that extends our intelligence, and it's going to keep going in that direction. We will continually develop new methods, and that's how we will get smarter. Not as individual little animals running around, but as communities who use technology.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Did that, oops, sorry. I muted you. Sorry, Michael, I muted you too soon. Thank you so much, Dr. Myers. I just really found this quite provoking. And Jim Peterson, I told you Michael was going to have the last question.
That's right. But
Sorry.
How can you be involved with spiders when you've got a beard like that?
Well, how else do you culture them?
Jim has a spider thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah, beards are great for growing spiders in.
Yes, they are.
Thank you so much. Quite thought-provoking and interesting and stimulating. Wasn't sure where we were going after reading your blog about what we were going to be confronted with, but I really appreciate your meeting with us and talking about this. It's been very, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're all dreading spiders, but like I said, I could come back and talk about spiders sometime.
I love spiders.
Oh yeah.
And I apologize for my camera not being on, but I have an intermittent problem with my connection, so I don't want to lose connection. But
sure.
Thank you so much, and you'll have to keep us up to date on when your spider.
Oh yeah, I'll have my eyes on them. Okay.
All right.
Hopefully
well,
not a brown recluse.